Welcome live from Jerusalem at our regular weekly webinar. ICEJ webinar is a series of online transmissions from Jerusalem covering many different subjects and many different types of programs. Just in the past 2 weeks, those of you who were watching, you saw that we started a new series looking at the Bible in Genesis and talking about the life of Abraham. We are building that program on the basis of the weekly readings, which are read in the synagogues all around the world, the Parashot. And we took also at some New Testament scriptures which are relevant. And this discussion with President Jürgen Bühler is going to continue next week. But we are interrupting the series today because we have another important anniversary coming up next week, and that's why we're going to look at the United Nations and their relation to Israel. The main reason is that on the 29th of November next week, we will mark 75th anniversary of an important UN vote for the partition of Palestine. This was the vote where the creation of 2 states was envisioned, and on the basis of that vote, David Ben-Gurion on the 14th of May the next year declared the independence of the state of Israel. Now, we will start with a historical look how that voting came into being and how Christians from different countries played an important role in that. This is part of our understanding of how what is called Christian Zionism can actually mark some successes in this diplomatic or political realm. And then we are going to move to a very hot current topic, namely how the relationship of the many different bodies at the United Nations towards Israel has developed and changed. And so we will hear how it looks like and what we could possibly do about it. So let me welcome our 2 panelists today. We have here Gil Kapen, Executive Director of the American Jewish International Relations Institute, which is an affiliate of B'nai B'rith International. Gil, it's great to have you. Welcome.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
So Gil will talk about this current aspect of our subject today. And before him, we will hear from my colleague, Vice President at the ICEJ, David Parsons, International Senior Spokesman, who has just come back, by the way, from a long trip to Africa. It's good to see you, David, that you came whole and healthy, and it's great to have you here on the program today. So welcome, and you can start with your part of the story.
Thanks, Mojmir. It's good to be back. God is doing good things in Africa, but we've come back to this really important moment in Israel, where next week is the 75th, next Tuesday, the 75th anniversary of the UN partition plan voted on 29 November 1947. And this, sets the stage for the 75th anniversary of Israel's rebirth as a nation come May of next year, an important milestone, something we celebrate. And we should be celebrating here on the 29th of November next week, but somehow the Palestinians over the years have managed to turn it into almost a day of mourning and a day of protest against Israel, and a day where every year they bring up a whole raft of anti-Israel resolutions at the United Nations. It's a day to bash Israel at the UN. It's a shame that they've just distorted history and changed it into this. And especially a shame when you consider, there's significant Christian remnants, Christian communities in a lot of countries that are voting for certain resolutions bashing Israel every year, and we should be making a difference there, and especially when you consider the unique Christian role which a couple Christian figures played in the passage of the UN partition plan in 1947. And I just want to take a couple minutes to talk about that before we start hearing from my friend Gil Kapen from my days of working in the US Congress when he was there working on the Middle East subcommittee in the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And it's always good to see Gil. But if you recall that 75 years ago, the British had been here for about 30 years during the Mandate era, but the Arabs and Jews were fighting over the land already, and they finally threw up their hands and said the British mandate over Palestine, it's unworkable. We can't keep the peace. That was in March of 47. And they sort of punted the ball over to the UN and said the UN was brand new. They said, do something about it. By the time the UN voted for partition, the British wanted back in to protect their interests in the Suez Canal, in the railway line, the oil lines coming up from the Arabian Peninsula for other reasons. And they tried to undermine what the UN was doing. But for the first time, there were several committees that had come to study the conflict and the troubles in Palestine. Before this, some were American, British committees, and they weren't so fair and impartial. This was the first sort of objective look at the conflict over the land here and trying to decide what to do about it. And as they came here, the thinking was several of the key members, there were 13, I think it was 13 members or 11 members on the UN Special Committee on Palestine, UNSCOP. And several of them were British Commonwealth countries. And the fear was they were going to sort of lead the thinking of the committee to sort of hand it back to Britain in some continuing role or something. And there wasn't a whole lot of support at first for the idea of a Jewish state, helping create a Jewish state here. But as the committee arrived in the summer of 47, you had this saga of the Exodus 47 ship. It was one of the many ships trying to bring Jewish refugees who had survived the Holocaust in Europe, survived World War II there. They were in displaced persons camps. They were refugees, many of them without shoes, without proper clothing, hungry and all. And they were coming on ships that were trying to break through the British blockade and reach the shores of Palestine. Many of them would beach themselves and the people would swim for shore. It was really desperate times. And the underground Haganah had actually, this Exodus 47 ship had 4,500 Jewish refugees from camps in Italy and France, somewhere from those areas. And they had packed them onto this ship, but they had gone to the US and found a Methodist pastor, Reverend John Stanley Graul, to volunteer. They talked him into volunteering. He was pro-Zionist. He'd been working for the Zionist movement there in the US. And they said, let's put you on that ship so that if something happens to it, if it gets attacked by the British like these other ships, you're an American citizen, you're not Jewish, you can be an impartial witness to what happens. So he signed on as like a cook or something. He signed on as part of the crew of the ship. And he witnessed the British attack the ship. And when they took control of it, there were two British frigates or ships, warships that went across on each side of the Exodus. It was an old passenger ferry. They used to run the Chesapeake Bay, shallow waters from Norfolk area, Hampton Roads up to Baltimore and back, and they tried to crush the sides of it. It was an old ship, and tried to crush it. Can you believe it? With 4,500 Jewish refugees, he's sitting there watching it. When they finally took control of the ship, the British took it to Haifa port. All the Jews were interned and were going to be sent back to Cyprus, but they say his passport, he's an American, he's not Jewish. They say, oh my goodness, we can't put him in a prison, in a camp, an internment camp. So they put him in a hotel, but put him under house arrest. Well, they snuck him out that night, the Jewish underground, took him to Jerusalem, where this UNSCOP committee was taking testimony in the YMCA auditorium in West Jerusalem. And he testified before the committee how the British soldiers with guns and clubs boarded this ship and were beating up young Jewish boys who only had potatoes and canned goods to fight with, and really roughed them up, beat them, and how they tried to crush the ship. And the whole saga of the Exodus, how it was attacked offshore, how everyone was put in camps in Cyprus and sent back to Europe. There was reporting on it by the international media that started to turn the thinking of the UNSCOP committee that this, for a lot of people, this was a life and death situation. And John Stanley Grovel's testimony, his presence on that ship and his testimony was very influential in turning the committee to the decision of the majority view was we need a Jewish and a Palestinian state there. And he actually is buried in the Missionary Alliance cemetery on Emek Rephaim here in Jerusalem, sort of an honor that he was so important. He's buried here in Jerusalem. And another guy that was important at this moment, another Christian, was Reverend William Hall from Canada. His father was a prominent attorney who knew Justice Ivan Rand, who was the Canadian member of the UNSCOP committee, was a member of the Canadian Supreme Court. And this Reverend William Hall, he had lived here for about 10 years, saw what was going on in the land, and had dinner at the YMCA one night on the balcony there with Justice Rand and explained the conflict, what was happening here to him. And Rand was considered like the conscience of the committee because Canada was a member of the British Commonwealth still. He was influential, and he turned against the British, said they had broken their mandate promise to build a Jewish state. They had limited immigration right when they needed it the most to save Jews from the menace of Hitler and the Nazis. They put a strict quota on land purchases by Jews for about 10 years that prevented the Jews from owning more property, more Jews from getting in. And he said it was time to get the British out. So Reverend William Hall and his influence, Reverend John Stanley Graul, and then a third Christian who was very important, was a member of the committee himself, the Guatemalan ambassador, Jorge Garcia Granados was his name. And he wrote a book later called The Birth of Israel. I think it's one of the important books that from those days of how when they visited Tel Aviv and saw what the Jews had built in only about 30 some years here in the land, a thriving city, he said a Jewish state can prosper here. We should give them a chance. And he was also an influential member of the committee, a Christian who was a Zionist, who convinced many on the rest of the committee, we got to give the Jews a chance to build their state. And it's an interesting little footnote of history that he was, part of the diplomatic corps for Guatemala as an ambassador who was a member of this UNSCOP committee. 6 months later, when Ben-Gurion declared the state of Israel, the Arabs at the UN had called an emergency station trying to stop what they knew was about to happen, Ben-Gurion announcing the state. And there was a lot of debate and such, but all of a sudden things fell quiet because Ben-Gurion had declared the state. So the session is basically obsolete, it's over. And the US ambassador goes up to the podium a couple minutes later and says, we recognize the provisional government of the new state of Israel. And Ambassador Granados was now Guatemala's ambassador to UN, and he rose and was became the second country, him going to the podium on his own authority. they became the second country to recognize the new state of Israel. I know many say the Soviets they were an important vote at the time because they thought that Israel would turn Bolshevik, pro-Bolshevik for them, but they didn't. They became a Western style democracy, but Guatemala was the second country to recognize Israel because of this Christian diplomat who had a heart for Israel. So those three figures were very important in this moment of the UN partition plan, which paved the way for the rebirth of Israel just 6 months later. But now the shame is that this day when we should celebrate, it's been turned into a day of protest and mourning against Israel, mourning for the Palestinians, a day to bash Israel at the UN. And we're really glad to have Gil Kapen with us to talk more about that and how we can turn this around into a day to really celebrate Israel's rebirth.
Thank you, David. Just going back for a moment to that vote on the 29th of November, 1947. I have the facts here. 33 countries voted in favor of the resolution. 13 were against, 10 abstentions, and 1 absent. So they got the majority they needed. And when I look at the countries, I see with some interest that many of those countries that voted in favor were actually from Latin America. We have Bolivia, yes, Brazil, Costa Rica, Dominican Republic, Ecuador, Guatemala, Haiti, Nicaragua, Panama, Paraguay, Peru, Uruguay, and Venezuela. Just imagine all those nations were in favor of the Jewish state back then. And this is quite interesting how things changed throughout the history. And as you say, unfortunately today, the United Nations has really turned that anniversary, and the Palestinian activists have turned it into a bashing day against Israel. And it would be very interesting to see how the voting patterns have changed over the years. And I guess that Gil has some information on that. And also, I would like to ask you to give it as your perspective, because you are very much involved, you know what is going on in the United States. And the question is, what can we as Christians who want to make our voice heard in the governments and in our countries, what can we actually do in order to turn the tide and have more nations which would vote for Israel and not for these anti-Israeli resolutions today? But Gil, the floor is yours. You're muted. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. It's great to be with you. It's an honor to be with you. David, my old friend, my old valiant friend for many, many years. And Mojmir, thank you very much for that introduction. It's Thanksgiving Day here in the United States. So it's important to be thankful for the many, many things that God has given us. And I think that the Jewish people and the state of Israel are thankful for the support over the years and to this day of Christians. And I always say, I don't know where Israel would be without its Christian friends. And you guys are right at the front line, right in the holy city. And I have a lot of appreciation for all of you. I listened with great interest to what both of you said, and there's a lot to unpack here. So let's start with David, your excellent historical background. Indeed, November 29th is an important date in Israel's history. It's the day where at the United Nations, the partition resolution was voted, giving the international imprimatur, legal imprimatur to Israel's establishment. Of course, Zionism existed for hundreds and thousands of years before that, and the yearning of the Jewish people is really the basis of the creation of Israel. But in the modern day, the rebirth of Israel was given legitimacy, international legitimacy, on that November 29th. And as you so correctly stated, David, unfortunately, November 29th at the UN has become a black day in terms of defamation of Israel. And Mojmir, you correctly pointed to the overwhelming Latin American support for Israel at the very beginning, at the partition resolution. Of course, at that time, there were really no independent African states. So Latin American countries were definitely represented, and I think almost all of them voted on behalf of statehood for Israel for the partition. Over the years, and David correctly pointed to the fact that the USSR was an early supporter. They supported partition. Famous speech, I think, by Andrei Gromyko at the UN, endorsing the creation of Israel. And they did indeed hope that Israel would become an ally of the communist world, would become a Bolshevik state, a Marxist state, and that's not what happened. So they turned against Israel with a vengeance and became the ringleaders of the anti-Israel propaganda apparatus around the world. And the UN started to become a focus of this anti-Israel activity. The turning point, I think, occurred in the 1970s, when the UN really started aggressively getting involved in a negative way in the Middle East. And this type of activity has contributed nothing, of course, to peace in the Middle East. If you look at all the positive developments, the Camp David Accords, running through the Abraham Accords, the UN really wasn't involved. And the fact that the UN is a center, especially on November 29th every year, of anti-Israel activity is unfortunately a continuation of a very negative trend. The Soviet Union is gone, but this is continuing to take place. So what happened in the 70s is the communist bloc, led by the Soviet Union and Cuba, allied with the Islamic bloc, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. I think at that time it was called the Organization of Islamic States. And at that time, Gaddafi had a lot of influence, and he and Castro basically got together and implemented this anti-Israel agenda that took force and incredibly continues to this day. So I always thought that November 29th is a bad day for them to be bashing Israel, because it reminds people that on November 29th, they rejected the partition resolution. There could have been a Palestinian state. Back then, they weren't calling it Palestinian. There could have been an Arab state in 1948 and ever since then. And the fact that there isn't really begs the question, what are they really after? Well, of course, we know they are mostly interested in abolishing Israel. They think the creation of Israel was a terrible thing, an abomination, and they are trying to undo it. In the 70s, the infamous Zionism is Racism was passed, actually November 1975, on the anniversary of Kristallnacht, of all things. They passed the Zionism is Racism resolution, this infamous act. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, the great ambassador, called it an infamous act and said the United States will never acquiesce in its implementation. What is less known is that the same day that Zionism is Racism was passed, the UN created two institutions, the Palestinian Division and the Palestinian Committee. And in 1991, when under the George H.W. Bush administration, the United States led the way in pushing for the abolishment of the Zionism is Racism resolution, they left intact this infrastructure. I think it was an oversight, because I think at that time, the United States had a lot of diplomatic clout, and it was a real full court press, starting with the president, pressuring countries to vote to repeal it. And indeed, it was repealed overwhelmingly. But this Palestinian Division and the Palestinian Committee continue to operate. And basically what they do is they serve as a focus of anti-Israel activity, support for BDS, defamation of Israel, the creation of a false image of Israel as an apartheid state, and really doing the institutional work of the anti-Israel political warfare around the world. Of course, there are other things, unfortunately, at the UN, in Geneva, for example, the UN Human Rights Council, and now we have this commission of inquiry that was set up. So there's mischief all along the way. But what has been permanent since 1975 is these two institutions, the Palestinian Division, the Palestinian Committee. They receive, unfortunately, overwhelming support. The reason they have to be voted on every year, now every 2 years, because in 2020 they received a 2-year mandate, is they have budgets. They actually are allocated money. And I see here on the screen, you can see these are the official names of these institutions, the Palestinian Committee and the Palestinian Division. And originally, they were getting, there was only 3 countries, I think, in the world that were voting against: the United States, Israel, and maybe one of the Pacific Island states. Over time, the support for these institutions has eroded, especially over the last 10 years. As more countries become aware of the nefarious activities of these institutions. But we still have a long way to go. Last time, the Palestinian Division received 82 affirmative votes, and the Palestinian Committee received, I think, 92. We're trying to work towards getting those numbers down, and eventually, if we can get them below 2/3 of the yeses and nos, then we'll have a case to say they should be eliminated. The United States, it has to be said, has always opposed these institutions under administrations from both parties, by the way, and lists them on a small annual list of important resolutions at the UN. But I think more can be done. More can be done by Friends of Israel, to press countries that are voting for this, to educate them as to what the nature of these activities are. And hopefully we can eventually close them down, because there's not only no reason for them to exist, but they actually do harm. They hurt the chances for peace. They don't help the Palestinians one iota. It's simply propaganda, support for activities like BDS, and really nothing positive comes out of it. So unfortunately, we have next week another vote coming up. We're hoping to see some more improvement, but I'm happy to answer any questions you have about that.
Well, thank you, Gil. That's very important. Before we move to questions, David, do you want to add something on that?
Well, I think it's a shame that it got overlooked by President George Bush in 1991, as they're coming out of the Gulf War and trying to prepare for the Madrid Peace Conference in October 1991, that in order for the U.S. to go forward with that, they demanded that the UN repeal the Zionism is racism resolution, but somehow it got overlooked that within the Secretariat of the UN, under the General Secretary of the UN's office, you have this permanent propaganda machine being paid for by all the countries around the world to churn out propaganda against Israel. And it really, I think, Gil, you hit it, that it was the Soviets who really taught the Palestinians how to talk about inalienable rights and all, talk in Western terms that are going to appeal to a Western audience, but undermine Israel's legitimacy. But I think it's also, it's not only anti-Israel, anti-Zionism propaganda, it's actually anti-Semitic stuff that our nations are paying the UN Secretary General's office to churn this out day after day.
Yeah, I think that's, first of all, absolutely true. And let me also make the point that when the Zionism is racism resolution was repealed in 1991, many African countries, even some that had voted in favor of the original resolution, voted to repeal or abstained on that resolution. And Africa has become very, very important in this battleground. First of all, in the 70s, as we all remember, as we all know, the Arab League pressured many African countries that had very good relations with Israel at that time. Israel was doing a lot to help those countries, doing a lot of development assistance in these newly emerging independent countries of Africa, who looked to Israel as a role model and as a big brother in terms of their own development. And the relations were really, really positive, beautiful relationships. And you just returning from Africa, you know how important those relationships are. There's still a long way to go, but starting in the 90s, African countries started coming back to restoring diplomatic relations with Israel. And that diplomatic effort was early on in that restoration of good relations between Israel and Africa. And in terms of doing work on these resolutions, Africa is extremely important. First of all, because there are many African countries, close to 50, not including the Arab League. So that's about a fourth of the entire United Nations right there. So there's a lot of votes. But also, morally speaking, I think it's very important to get the Africans to support Israel. Of course, we have this effort at the AU for Israeli observer status. That's also part of this. But at the UN, unfortunately, their voting pattern was set in the 70s by this Soviet Islamic cooperation effort. And it's held to a certain extent. It's eroded, but it's still, there's still this perceived alliance that the African countries have, this third world mentality that took hold in the 70s. It's kind of preposterous that it still holds today, but I think there's a lot of African countries who feel like there's this consensus position, which there isn't. And just to point out one example of the erosion of this and how we're on a positive trend, about 10 years ago, around 2010, 2011, more than half of the African Union countries were voting in favor of these two resolutions. Now it's less than half. It's down to, it went from 33 countries to 24 countries. So we still need to do some work there, because none of them are voting against it, except for Liberia has now voted no on one of the resolutions. So we need to really credit them for that. But we need to get Rwanda and Ghana and Kenya and Uganda, Togo, countries that have friendly relations with Israel, but they need to start showing it at the UN. And I think once the ice is broken, I think it'll be easier to continue to get other countries. But Africa is extremely important.
Yeah, thank you for saying that, Gil, because we also have many offices in different African countries, and in certain cases we have access to parliaments or governments or presidents. So this would really be something very high on our agenda. And you are right, times have changed. The Islamic states that used to pressure sub-Saharan Africa to go against Israel, but look at what's going on. We have Abraham Accords. We have several Arab countries which already made peace with Israel, and others still under the radar, but the relationships are quite clearly going in a positive direction. So there should be no argument why Africans, if Arabs are making peace with Israel, why Africans shouldn't improve their relationships. And I believe also that the fact that Israel has regained the observer status at the African Union is a significant, signal. Even though there were pressures against that, so far the voting was upheld. So we do see this dynamic. But my question would be, what are some of the talking points that we could use when trying to convince the respective governments, especially in Africa, that they should take another look at the voting pattern?
I happened to have been having dinner a few weeks ago with a foreign minister of a significant African country. And when I told him about this, he was surprised, which I think is not an uncommon thing. They don't know what their own ambassadors are doing at the UN. It's kind of an inertia type thing. These things are going on for years. So the ambassador says, well, how did we vote last year? I'm going to vote the same way. Or there's still some peer pressure, maybe some more nefarious types of pressure going on at the UN. But the ambassadors are generally on their own. unless they receive instructions from home. So this foreign minister said, you let me know, and he gave me his cell phone number. You let me know when these votes are up so I can instruct my ambassador. Now we'll see if it actually happens, but I'll certainly remind him this week. But I think, and I will share with you a one-pager that we've done analyzing the activities of these two institutions, and you can distribute it as you see fit. But I think the main thing is, well, I would say two things. Number one, these are institutions that are a waste of money. They achieve nothing whatsoever. They've been around now for 40 years. It's preposterous in this day and age that they're still continuing using the money of the member states of the UN, mainly US taxpayers, frankly speaking, to undertake these types of negative activities, which do nothing. It's not a humanitarian organization. They are completely anomalous within the UN system. This division for Palestinian rights, there is no other division that is named after a people or a country. You have the division for Latin America or the division for Europe, and then you have some functional division for humanitarian affairs and so forth, and then the division for Palestinian rights. It's ridiculous. And the same thing with the Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People, or a third institution that I haven't mentioned because they're not up for a vote this year, the Special Committee to Investigate Israeli Human Rights Practices. Again, no other country has the honor of a committee devoted to it. But interestingly enough, in the history of the UN, there was one other country that had a similar special committee, and that was apartheid South Africa. And it had the same exact name, the Special Committee to Investigate South African Human Rights Practices. So it was obvious that this Special Committee on Israel was set up to parallel South Africa and to create the impression that Israel is an apartheid state. And again, that's where Africa comes in. Because if you convince the African countries that Israel is an apartheid state, of course they'll be opposed to it. Why would they support an apartheid state? So I think part of the challenge is to educate people. First of all, you guys are doing it every day to show the world the true face of Israel. What is Israel really about? It's a constant struggle because the resources are limited. There's a lot of disinformation out there, but you guys are doing a really great job to change a lot of minds for the better and to educate Christians and other people around the world about Israel. I would also say that, as you pointed out, Mojmir, so correctly, in a day where we have the Abraham Accords, where we have Azerbaijan opening an embassy in Israel, this 100% Muslim country, a Shiite Muslim country, less opening an embassy. It's preposterous for countries to be voting for institutions which basically negate Israel's existence. One of the underlying facets of the Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People is a definition of those inalienable rights. And it's spelled out in their original charter, and it's on their website. And one of those inalienable rights is the so-called right of return, which is not a legal right whatsoever. Of course, as we know, there have been refugee situations all over the world. There still are. There's no such thing as a right of return. You have Germans who were expelled from Poland. There's no right of return for Germans. World War II, you had massive population exchanges. In Asia, we've seen this. The 48 war was imposed on Israel. These refugees were created. Of course, there were Jewish refugees also from Arab states that were absorbed into Israel. But this committee and UNRWA and other UN institutions continue to talk about this right of return, which, if you look at it in an objective way, is really a recipe for the destruction of Israel. Because, of course, no Israeli government would ever go along with that. But if Israel was somehow, God forbid, forced to accept 5-6 million refugees, it would change the character of Israel, and Israel would no longer exist as a Jewish state. And that's really what these institutions are calling for. So I think pointing that out and saying, look what you're voting for. This is where you're voting for what you think is an innocuous sounding office, Palestinian Committee, the Palestinian Division, but really they're working to undermine Israel. And I don't think a lot of the countries that are voting for these institutions mean to do so.
I'd say that the PLO has turned the writer turned not only an inalienable right, but a sacred right that no one can dispose of or compromise on it, a holy right. It's quite a maximalist position they've taken on it. Look, I think in both Latin America and Africa and in some Asian countries as well, there's been tremendous growth in the evangelical churches, and they are starting to mature politically in some of these countries to where, say in Brazil, they helped elect a president, Bolsonaro, for one term. He just lost, but I think some of the evangelical votes split on him. Some of the media turned people against him, but he was very pro-Israel. And I noticed in the voting, Brazil voted against these resolutions last year. And in Latin America, this Ambassador Granados, who recognized Israel, was part of UNSCOP. He's actually respected all through Latin American world as a great diplomat. And he sort of represented the view back then. These Latin American countries had a very favorable view of Israel as a developing country like them, but one that was making it. It was like a model for a young democracy that was progressing and making it into the developed world. And they looked at it and said, it's even a model for us. And with the growth of the evangelical churches, we're hoping many of these votes continue to start turning in Israel's favor, not only on these resolutions elsewhere. In Africa, much the same. The evangelical vote is growing. Say in Nigeria, it's about a third of the population is now evangelical Christians, and they're having influence. They elected this Goodluck Jonathan a few years ago, who helped block a Palestinian state in the UN Security Council. And we were involved in his decision on that. In East Africa, there should be more influence, but the evangelicals, they're still maturing politically. They have to fight corruption in their countries. That's a high priority for them. But most of them want their nations to move their embassies into Jerusalem. But this voting at the UN, it is something that happens in a diplomatic bubble that most people don't know about. Even the foreign minister that you met with, he doesn't know how they're voting. The president of the country doesn't know. And those diplomats at the UN, they're going, I remember Dory Gold, who used to be Israel's ambassador to UN, he said, look, a lot of these guys, they're going to a cocktail party that night with other diplomats, and they don't want to be laughed at like the only country that voted with Israel, like Micronesia. It's sort of the little world that they're in there at the UN, that little bubble. They don't want to be the laughing stock in the social circles there, and so they just keep voting that same pattern. And something has to break through that. I know a lot of these countries in Africa, Mojmir can vouch for this. If Israel would share more of its technology with these African countries and really reach out to them like they did under Golda Meir in the 50s and 60s, you would see a real change. That if Israel itself were to invest or cooperate with the US or Europe in investing in Africa more, that it has to break and override, say, the Chinese influence in Africa right now to really turn these votes for Israel, get them to move their embassies to Jerusalem, some of the things that we're all hoping for.
Yeah, and you are right that that's a lot of truth in the fact that these members of government, foreign ministers actually do not know what's going on at the UN. And this could be one point which we might try to break into by making them aware that we are following that. Which leads me to the question, Gil, can you help us find a simple page where people could easily find the voting record on those resolutions? Do you have something like that?
We certainly do. But I was struck by what David was just talking about. It's very interesting. Our organization was founded by Ambassador Richard Shifter, who was a legendary American diplomat. He was the deputy ambassador at the UN under Jeane Kirkpatrick, great ambassador, and he was the US representative at the UN Human Rights Commission, among other diplomatic assignments. He was a Holocaust survivor who fought with the Ritchie Boys, legendary American Army intelligence unit in World War II. And he, in his time at the UN, realized that there were a lot of shenanigans going on at the UN. And he thought his background was in politics. He was a lawyer and he was very active politically. And he understood that the UN is like a parliament. It's like the US Congress. And you really have to look at votes one by one. So he felt that not enough was being done and more could be done to whip for votes, not just on Israel, but across the board. Because if you look at voting coincidence with the United States, most of the countries that we have good relations with, we give a lot of foreign assistance to, they vote against us at the UN all the time. And Israel is part of that picture. And again, this dates back to the 70s, that antagonistic attitude that was set up by the Soviet Union against the United States and its allies. But if you go country by country, and again, it's not about just these votes, we want to see these relationships flourish. So you're right, it's important to talk about where Israel can be helpful with these countries. And Israel does a lot, but certainly it needs to continue, it needs to be expanded. Brazil, you mentioned, David, is an interesting case. And this gets me into the subject of evangelical support. Brazil, we're worried about now because they just had an election and Bolsonaro was voted out. So you're right, last time they did vote no, but let's see what happens this time. We're certainly worried about that. And we need to pick up other countries. We need to pick up Panama. We need to pick up Costa Rica, Dominican Republic. Guatemala has been solid. And a big part of it is the evangelical support for Israel. And Guatemala, in fact, had a evangelical Christian president, Jimmy Morales, who made the decision to move the embassy to Jerusalem. And he's also the one who changed their vote from abstaining on these resolutions to voting no. And it's continued now year by year. So, we certainly appreciate Guatemala. In terms of the overall voting patterns, we have these some Latin American countries voting no. Guatemala, Honduras, again, we'll see what happens with the new government. Brazil, Colombia, there's been kind of a negative trend in Latin America. In Europe, very interestingly, the traditional position had been to abstain on these resolutions, because they always wanted to be seen as not voting against the Palestinians. But starting a few years ago, some countries, Germany, Hungary, Austria, Czech Republic, Greece, they started looking at this objectively and saying, this isn't contributing to peace, this isn't a good thing. And they started voting no, at least on one of the resolutions. We want to see more European countries join them, and we want to see that continuing. The Pacific Islands, yes, it's true. Marshall Islands, Micronesia, Nauru, Papua New Guinea have been voting well. And these are countries that are Christian countries and Christian supporters of Israel. So I think the evangelical Christians around the world can certainly weigh in with their governments. In Africa, certainly you have these strong communities that you alluded to and that you visited, David. You have Kenya and Tanzania and Uganda, Rwanda, Ghana. It's important to get the word out and get these communities to understand the stakes involved and to weigh in with their governments. In terms of actually looking up the voting records or getting more information, you can go to our website. It's ajiri.us, AJIRI.us, and you'll see all the background information on these resolutions and on activity at the UN against Israel, and also a platform where you can look up any country in the world and see their voting record on these resolutions, and it's up to date.
Well, thank you. That's very helpful. And indeed, one of the comments I read here on our session is that actually, and this is our task, churches in Africa and Latin America needs to be educated about Israel in this political sense and also in the biblical sense, because my experience from Latin America is to them, they have enough of their own problems and Israel is very, very far away. And so they really don't pay much attention. And of course, they need to be convinced first if they are to convince their elected officials. So this is something that I take as a goal for further educating our constituency. We have 91 countries where we do have some kind of representation, many of them are actually growing in Latin America and growing in Africa. David has just returned. I was in Central Africa in June, and I'm going to Uganda in 2 weeks' time. So we really keep our focus on those nations because it's important, and this is what we see is our role to educate the church about these issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would add that, like, if you're really trying to crack the nut of Africa, it's you know, South Africa has a lot of diplomatic influence over African votes. Egypt is sort of the diplomatic leader of much of the Arab world. And of course, I think Nigeria is very influential in West Africa. But within the African, the OAU, the African Union, you have smaller subdivisions, like there's a union of East African countries that are Swahili speaking, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Burundi, and there's about 6 or 7, I think they're trying to add Ethiopia to it. And then in the West, you have the Francophone countries that have banded together. Each are sort of their own little economic common market. That's what they're trying to create. And in West Africa, they have a common currency. It's a certain type of West African franc. And there may be a way where we could send a joint Christian-Jewish delegation to meet with some of the leaders of those, you know, unions that have, you know, the West Africa, it's 15, 18 countries, I think. In East Africa, it's I think it's up to 7 countries now. That it'd probably be worth a trip to try and meet with some of those regional leaders and make the case.
Well, amen to all that, first of all, but let me just say that South Africa, unfortunately, is a big problem right now. It's a work in progress, but South Africa kind of is a ringleader of anti-Israel activity in Africa and at the UN. And also anti-American activity. There's they're very aggressive diplomatically in opposing Israel. They're the leaders of the anti-Israel faction within the AU against Israeli observer status even at the AU. But again, the Christian community, I think, can play a positive role there. And by the way, I don't think that because a country is Muslim that automatically, in this day and age especially, we can write them off. We have to make alliances with Muslims, courageous Muslims who are reaching out to Israel. And there are more and more of them, as you know, and you probably interact with them. So it's important to build those alliances. Egypt, unfortunately, has not been a good actor in terms of Israel at the UN. And part of that dates back to the fact that they signed the Camp David Accords. They were the first Arab country to make peace with Israel. So they wanted to prove to the rest of the Arab world. They felt they needed to prove to the rest of the Arab world their bona fides against Israel. So they bash Israel more than anybody at the UN. It's changing a little bit under Sisi, and we'll see where this goes. But unfortunately, at the UN, you know, their voting record is 100% negative, and their rhetoric has been less than helpful.
Well, there's certainly a lot of work to do, but it's been great to hear your insights and also to have all these data available, which we are certainly going to use in our efforts. Any final words, Gil, before we close?
I would just say first, it's always an honor to be with you. I appreciate what you all are doing, and let's continue this dialogue. I really agree with you that a lot can be done in terms of reaching out. I didn't know that 91 countries now. Wow, that's great. Keep it up, get to 100 soon and go past 100. And certainly we have a lot of mutual interests and we can work together on this and other things. I look forward to seeing you in Israel.
Thank you. Thank you for your contribution, David.
Yeah, look, I visited the offices of the East African Union in Arusha a couple years ago and met with some of the officials who work there, and it's quite interesting that they hold a prayer meeting in those offices every day to pray for their countries, and they pray for Israel. And I just think there's some good opportunities instead of trying to pick off one nation at a time, and to grab several nations at a time to really tip the balance on this. It is a black mark on the UN and even on our own nations that we support the publication and dissemination of anti-Semitic, not just anti-Israel, but anti-Semitic materials out of the UN Secretary General itself. And we need to change this and turn November 29, next Tuesday, into a day that we celebrate as an important milestone in Israel's modern day rebirth. Amen.
Yes. And we are going to encourage our representatives in all those countries to look at that date and to make a public statement or something, or to let their governments know that we really care. And that's really a great example of a part of the calling of the ICEJ. It has been written in our original mandate back in 1980 that we are to make efforts to inform the world and to become effective influences on behalf of Israel and the Jewish people all around the world. So that's what we are trying to do. And it's great to have such allies like Gil and this organization. It's great to know you, to be working with you, and I'm sure this is not the last time that we talk. So all the best, and thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you.
Okay, we want to remind everyone that next week we have the Global Prayer Gathering next Wednesday at 4 p.m. We'll be back here next Thursday at 4 p.m. coming to you from Jerusalem with another weekly webinar, so join us then. For those who are on our mailing list, you're going to get in tomorrow's ministry update an article, an essay, a commentary on the webinar subject today. And please look at that, and please make a point to be in contact with your government, your elected officials, about treating Israel fairly at the UN. We say God bless you and shalom from Jerusalem.
Shalom. Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us today. We'll see you next Thursday at 4 p.m. Be sure to subscribe and follow us on our social media pages for more exclusive ICEJ content.